Thank you, Steve, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 15th Annual Business Insurance Women to Watch Leadership and Awards Conference. It is my distinct honor to chair the Women to Watch Foundation, and I want to personally thank the members of the Women to Watch Foundation Board for their hard work this year in raising funds, and to our key sponsor, Sedgwick. Your work has made a difference in elevating the health and well-being of women and girls around the world, and for the work that we've been doing with cervical cancer education in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, each year we recognize 20 women for their accomplishments in the business insurance sector. And 3 years ago, we added an award to this recognition, and that's the Inspiration Award. And the Inspiration Award is given to a single individual who has demonstrated leadership and established themselves as a role model for women coming up in the industry. And it is my pleasure and my honor to recognize Dame Inga Beale as the 2020 Business Insurance Women to Watch Inspiration Award. Inga, thank you for your accomplishments. Thank you for the work that you've done to advance the industry and for advancing the careers of women in the industry as well. Congratulations to you on behalf of Business Insurance and the Women to Watch Foundation.
Well, thank you, Linda, and thank you all, the whole team. This means a lot to me to think that I can be an inspiration to other women coming through the insurance sector. It's just a fabulous feeling. So thank you very much, and I'll treasure this.
Absolutely well deserved. And Inga, it's these accomplishments that I'd actually like to explore with you a little bit this morning with our audience. You have been gracious enough to come to help kick us off today and to share your experiences and give us some advice on how to think about leading during times of crisis, what it's like to be a change agent within an organization, particularly as a woman in the industry. So let's get started if we can. You started your career in the insurance industry in the early 80s. Talk a little bit about what it's like, what it was like to kind of enter into a very male-dominant industry, and particularly in London, and some of the things that you encountered and lessons that you learned, if you would.
Yeah, well, London has a very unique place in, I suppose, in the history of insurance. And the London market is quite famous for looking at business from all over the world. And I was, I suppose, fortunate to have ended up in insurance, actually reinsurance. I started as a reinsurance trainee underwriter. And what was so amazing about starting in the world of reinsurance, particularly in the London market, was that it was so global. And you know, one day I'd be looking at insurance or reinsuring an insurance company from Australia, then it might be Chile, Japan, you know, all over the world. It was absolutely fascinating. And I can't take away that sort of excitement of feeling that you were doing something really purposeful as a job. And I didn't even know that reinsurance existed before I started in the world of reinsurance, but I got hooked on it. However, the City of London, which is where the London market was a very unique place in those days, very isolated from the rest of London in terms of it was the financial district. There were almost no shops. I think there was a tiny little store where you could buy a few provisions. If you were somebody who had to cook when you got home in the evening, you would find a little bit that you could buy to actually take home to eat. But fundamentally, it was just businesses. Very, very different place to what it is now. Nowadays, it's much more colourful, it's sort of vibrant, lots of things happening. But in those days, it was just the financial district. And for those who may be familiar with the London market, the only other thing that sort of, I suppose, brought it some colour amongst all the grey buildings were the pubs. And I must admit, you know, pub culture was very much part of the day in those days. I mean, I look back now, I'm sort of shocked. But I was working in a very male-dominated environment, wanting to be one of the boys. I just wanted to fit in with them, which meant that I made frequent visits to the pub with the boys. and just wanted to fit in because I was so unusual. And even though I didn't start off in the Lloyds market, it was the London market, so it was a company, but we still had a very open sort of trading environment, just like Lloyds did. I suppose COVID has changed things a little bit. So I would be an underwriter sitting at a desk with brokers walking in off the street, unannounced, no appointments. They'd ask to come and see underwriters, they'd queue up, and then I would see these brokers and we would negotiate deals. And that was how I grew up, in a frontline environment. But 35 underwriters, and I was the only female. So it was, in a way, a bit of a lonely time. I think the way I sort of got through those early years was that I played sport a lot. So my sort of escape was going and mixing with my teammates, or my rowing crew, because I rowed for a few years, all women. And I suppose that was the safety net that kept me going, and took me away from what was a very male environment and not necessarily very welcoming for a young woman in the 80s.
And you said something that intrigues me, because I think this crosses geographic lines, whether you're talking about the UK or the US. You said that you went to the pubs because you wanted to fit in, you wanted to participate in that male environment. And I think particularly in the early 80s and as we moved into the 90s, we found that women were adopting some of the worst characteristics of men when we encountered each other, in a professional environment, not just woman to woman, but if we were, attempting to make our voices heard in a meeting, perhaps we were louder, or, and I wonder if you think that some of that served you well, or if you felt as though, at times you were not being your true self. And I've even read something where you said there are times where you have to adapt, right? You have to, you don't want to lose your true self, but you have to adapt to the situation. Tell me a little bit about how that was in the 80s for you, and what you might have transitioned into present day.
Well, I didn't really know about that adapting until much later on. So when I became more experienced. And in those days, I in a way, I also wasn't taking my career that seriously because sport was ruling my life. So I came to work, I enjoyed the work, and I enjoyed the excitement of the business itself. So as I said, reinsuring things from all over the world, which was very fascinating. So I didn't really understand about this adapting to the situation. I just tried to be like the boys. I tried to fit in. And of course, what happened was that was okay for a while. And then something happened. I've been working for about 8 years, and then a very sexist incident occurred, and it was sort of, now I've had enough. And I sort of snapped one day. And that was very interesting, because it wasn't as though I was aware that I was building up to this point of getting bored with it or getting impatient with the lack of respect by men for women. It wasn't that. It happened very quickly. And overnight, that was it. I said, I'm out of here. I am not going to work here anymore. It's so chauvinistic. I've got to leave the world of insurance. And that was what happened.
And that's an interesting journey. I think we've all hit that point, or we can reflect and find that milestone moment when maybe we felt the same way. You left, you took off, you traveled around the world for a little bit, and it sounds like you did some self-assessment. What was it that then triggered you to come back in and decide, you know what, I can do this. I am ready for this. I will take this on.
I did. I literally packed a rucksack, left all my other belongings with a friend who had space, and I just left. I hadn't planned anything. I had planned only the next airport I was landing at. Got on that plane, and I landed at Bombay, as it was called then, Mumbai now. Didn't know what I was going to do. Didn't know where I was going to stay that night or whatever. And that was how I managed my travels. And it was an amazing time, because everywhere I met, particularly, I suppose, because I was on my own, I got talking to the people who were often living there, some of them travelers, but more of the case of meeting the local people. because otherwise I wasn't having a conversation with anyone. So I was always striking up conversations and traveling. This was in the late 80s, early 90s, sort of that crossover period. Traveling through India as a lone woman came up with all sorts of extraordinary events just on its own, because you were a very odd thing at that time to be traveling on your own. But I had amazing times. And then after some months, I landed in Sydney, Australia, having gone through many other countries in Asia. And then I needed some money. As I said, I hadn't planned the trip. So I had no money left, and I really needed to pay for some lodging, you know, I needed to eat.
Yeah.
And I got a job as the receptionist at the BBC. And the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, had a small satellite office in Sydney. And I got the job as a receptionist for 6 weeks, and it gave me some money. What I didn't realize was that I would be totally inspired by the manager of that office, who was a woman. And she was a woman. She wore a pantsuit to the office. Now, I had come from the City of London. In those days, you couldn't even walk into Lloyds if you were a woman in a pair of pants. You had to wear a skirt or a dress. So here I was in Sydney, looking at the most senior person in the office as a woman. And the very important thing that struck me was nobody talked about her gender. Nobody mentioned that she was a woman. She was the boss, and they all respected her. And I thought, gosh, perhaps you can make it as a woman. You know, I'd never seen a role model like this before. And I thought, gosh, I can do this. And that was why when I came back after a year, I actually got offered my old job back. And I refused to go permanent. I said, no, I'll only take a contract, because I thought I'm not going to go, I don't want to end up right back in the company that I'd worked in for 8 years. But I did go on a contract basis, but I said, I'm going to do it my way. And it changed me. And that's when I started to realize, actually, I'm just going to be me. And if I want to wear a pantsuit to the office, I'm going to wear a pantsuit. And it was that sort of thing. And it was very much down to this inspirational role model. She didn't know she was being an inspiration to me. She didn't know she was a role model. And that's why I say to women everywhere, you're being watched by people all the time. You're being listened to. So all of us, actually everybody, but if you think about the power of being a female role model to others, it's extraordinary, because you may not even know that people are looking up to you in the way that they are.
And that's an interesting point that you make, because oftentimes I think we seek out more formal mentorship relationships. We find that one person that maybe has insight into our specific career, but I think it does go deeper than that. I think that you know, the journey that we all take is made up of many experiences, and we can, if we open our eyes to what's going on around us, you know, I think that sharing that insight with each other, but more importantly, kind of living your truth. I mean, and then that's a lot of what you're saying is you finally found that authentic voice inside of yourself, and you decided to stick with that. And I'm quoting you. You at one point had said that the insurance industry nearly lost you because they didn't respect people for their differences. And to be sustainable, that you need to embrace inclusion. And that's a really powerful statement, particularly as we gather each year, whether it's the EMEA program now that's been with us for 5 years with Women to Watch, or the US program. You know, it's about making sure we don't miss some amazing talent in our organizations now, because we're looking through a very narrow lens. And when we broaden that lens, we broaden ourselves and open ourselves up as organizations to incredibly amazing talent. Now, you've talked a lot about kind of living and working in the UK, and although there are a lot of similarities, there certainly are differences between kind of what was happening in the 80s and 90s in the UK and what was happening in the United States. But in 1992, you actually did move to the United States, correct? If I have my timeline right.
It was a little bit later. I joined a US company. I joined GE in 92.
Very good.
I didn't move to the US until 2001.
Okay.
But with GE. But I worked for an American company from 92. Yeah.
And what were some of the biggest differences that you saw, you know, with companies here in the U.S., particularly how we were embracing diversity?
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate, I suppose, to work for GE, because GE, and I know it's going through its rough times now, but in those days it was a real powerhouse, and it was an acquisition machine, particularly in the capital side of it. We were buying all sorts of companies everywhere. It was very, very exciting. But what it did was it took talent management very seriously, and it used to plan business and then talent, and it used to spend the same amount of time basically on planning the talent as it did on the business. That's how important GE saw its talent, its major resource. And as part of that, GE was promoting women, promoting people from different ethnicities, and it was proactive. And that was unheard of from any other company that I was working in London. Absolutely. I mean, it was way ahead of the game, but we were part of that. So even though we were a small office in London, we were part of that. And that's what basically took me to the US, because they were really after promoting you and proactively. And so for me, it was a fantastic opportunity. What I do smile about this sometimes is the teamwork. Because what I did realize, and it was because we think we speak the same language, i.e. English, I didn't do any cultural awareness training or anything like that GE offered. And big companies, I'm sure, when they when they put people around the world and put them in assignments around the world, often they will give you cultural training just before you move, so you understand etiquettes and things like that. I didn't think I needed it. So of course I arrived in the US thinking I know it all. I found it actually to be quite different. And one of the things that I got a bit frustrated with about when I was in London, we used to get a lot of team building sort of training and exercises that we used to have to do. And in the UK, you actually all work as teams naturally. I don't know, it's a very sort of buddy environment, quite informal in a way. But we were then thinking, why is there all this focus on teams? This is, of course, how we operate. And then I moved to the US and I realized how sort of ultra competitive it was. And I thought, gosh, no wonder they have to get people to work in teams so much, because actually, and I think it comes perhaps through some of the schooling, people are thought to be very much, independent. I can do it. I can do it. And so that alone took me a little bit of adjusting. And there were many other things actually that, I sort of talk all day about the cultural differences, but because fundamentally our cultural differences are quite large between the Brits and the Americans, although it wasn't perhaps in those days, because now I think social media, the media, films and everything, they cross all sorts of boundaries. And I think the world in that way is getting much, much smaller, and those cultural differences are actually reducing.
Right, wonderful. And you just said something I want to double back on just a little bit, and that is this essence of competition that exists in the U.S. offices. And you're absolutely right. We are raised with a business acumen and work ethic that says, I am going to drive hard, and the measurement of my success is a particular position or status or what have you. And it feels better, I think, at times in the US when you can say, I did that myself. Now, having said that, I think it's my opinion that women bring something very unique to that process. And I think it's one of the things that has allowed us to excel when given the opportunity in a leadership role. And that is of empathy, of teamwork, of collaboration. So did you come in, observe this, and then work to bring that level of collaboration and try to break through that competitive set directly as a result of your role?
Yes, and of course we all hate generalizations, but I think in my experience, when I've seen a lot of the females I've hired or have been working with, they do bring that. They bring an essence of conflict resolution rather than sort of seeking out conflict. They want people to work together, and they often want the team to be successful. But what I've also witnessed, which is sometimes to the females' detriment, is they're always filling the gaps of others. And I've seen this many times, and I used to do it. I want the team to be successful. So if somebody over there wasn't doing what they should do, I would try and fill the gap, make sure it was done so that the collective was successful. And I've seen that a lot for females. And sometimes we have to I often tell women they should perhaps put themselves in the center a little bit more and not always think of others, because you've got to get that balance right. But yes, I did that when I came, and I was fortunate. I was setting up a new function when I moved to the US, so I could hire and handpick my own team. And I made sure it was gender balanced. We had people from all over the world, so different cultures working together. And I do remember, though, after a while, I inherited another team. And this is what I think about is so important, to work proactively on diversity. I inherited a small team to join my team after about, I suppose, 6 months, 8 months. And I went in to meet them all. And they were, I think, 4 or 5 white, grey-haired men. And the problem was, the next time I met them all, I couldn't remember who was Tom, Dick, or Harry, because I couldn't just differentiate between them, because they were like clones of each other. And I sort of walked in and I thought, I can't remember the names. And it sort of hit me to say, it's so important that we have diverse teams here, because all of these people, they're kind of the same and they're speaking the same thing. So how are we going to get creative here? How are we going to make sure we keep modernizing our processes and move forward? So I had many wonderful experiences, and not all of it taught. Some of it you just learn on the job, through your experiences.
Right, absolutely. And then as you left GE, you moved into another role at Converium, correct? And as we talked about that a little bit, that particular experience, again, as you grew in your kind of personal, comfortable in your own skin and with who you are, but you found yourself now leading within an organization that was in some ways going through its own crisis, right? It was a turnaround situation. There was a hostile takeover. And so, again, I think it's one thing to find yourself as you move into your role and lead an organization that is stable and healthy and, positive in many ways. It's another then to step into a leadership role during a time of crisis. And there's a couple of things I want to explore with you in that regard, and that is, how did that situation differ for you? Did you have to, again, going back to that kind of adaptability, did you have to find yourself shifting just a little bit in certain ways, and what were those? And were you able to really move things forward and to gain credit for those accomplishments, or were you really kind of tagged with the current situation of the organization, which was tumultuous, or however you might describe that?
Well, I know that they had searched for a CEO for Converium for 1 year, because it was a disaster, I'm afraid. Long tail reserves in North America were hurting the company, and so they had to close down the US piece, and they were really struggling. The rating agencies had downgraded the company. They'd hemorrhaged business. Their market cap had been smashed, and they had been looking for a CEO for 1 year. And I know some of the guys had been asked to take over, and they all said no. Now they then approached me. And
let me stop you. Why do you think they said no? Not to interrupt you, but I'm curious. I mean, that was a significant role.
It was a CEO of a publicly listed company. So for me, it was a big step, because I'd run a big division within a massive corporation, but now I was going to be the top shop. I believe some of the men said no because it just appeared too risky. And what I've discovered over the years is that, the more you have to protect, the more, you feel worried about going outside of that. So I find that a lot of men, they were very concerned about their reputation. They built their reputation up over years. They thought it was too risky to put their strong reputation on the line for this. I didn't have that. I wasn't part of that club. I was a female coming along, being approached, perhaps a bit left field for some people to think that I could have moved from running a division to now running a publicly listed company in a crisis.
Yeah.
And I took it because, not that I wanted to leave GE, but GE had just sold the business I was working in. So that was why I decided to take it. And I thought, oh, this sounds very exciting. I had no idea what I was letting myself in for, absolutely none. But I think my naivety sort of helped me because I just approached things in a very open way. I did change half my exec team, and that was important because I realized that I needed to get some new blood in, reinvigorate the organization. And we actually did a wonderful turnaround. We got our ratings back from the rating agencies within a year. We doubled the market cap. It really was. I felt that I'd nurtured a child back to life or something. And when the hostile takeover came, I was devastated. I mean, really devastated. I had never felt something to be ripped away from me like this, and that's how it felt. Now, Converium it was a reinsurance company, so it only did reinsurance, but it did global reinsurance. And it was actually spun off out of the Zurich Insurance Group many years ago. But it was, by the time we did the turnaround, a very attractive asset because we'd cleaned up all the reserves. And that's when the hostile takeover came from SCOR, who said, oh, now this is a nice, tidy little asset. And it was basically sort of being taken away from me because they didn't need two CEOs if they were going to buy Converium. And it was very, very sad. But what I also found during that time was how strong you have to be, particularly when you're the CEO. And I communicated and communicated and communicated. And I know we talk a lot about the power of communication, but never more so than in a crisis. And even if you don't know the answers, this was when I realized it was better just to get up, spur of the moment, and say something to people, admitting what you don't know yet, being open about what you're still working on. That to me was a really, really big learning, which I used later on. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Because people want to think that someone's looking after them in a crisis. And you can show your vulnerabilities, that you don't know all the answers, but they want to feel that someone is looking after them and actually working on solving the situation. As it happened, we did the deal. We secured everybody's job, which was very important to me. I didn't want anyone to be let go. So we secured everyone's job. And I think now looking back, it was a wonderful learning experience for me. And it was a goodbye for SCOR because they've done very well off the back of that acquisition.
That's fantastic. And I can certainly imagine having brought something through that terrible time, that difficult time, building the kind of teams that you must have built in order to accomplish that, that it must have been really difficult during that takeover to kind of watch that be handed off. But, I think the other thing is when you can build something that has a legacy and you know that what you've left behind, will sustain beyond that, that's really important. I think that's leaving, our current positions in a position where the next person can easily take them and move them forward speaks volumes about the individual who's leading that company or that team at that point in time. So from there you joined Zurich and made another shift into another large insurance carrier in the industry. Talk a little bit about your experiences at Zurich. You had commented that in many ways equipped you for the next big transition, and that is what we'll get to in a second, your CEO role at Lloyds. But talk a little bit about how that foundation at Zurich continued to prepare you.
Yes, it was, of course, and still is a very, very global company. And I had two roles during my time there. One was to lead the Zurich way, it was called in those days. It was fundamentally a major transformation of the company. Zurich and many companies have done this over the past. They've made hundreds of acquisitions around the world, but not really integrated them. So each company, in whatever country it was operating in its own way. And the CEO at the time was Jim Shiro, who hired me. And he was very clear he wanted there to be a Zurich way of doing things. He wanted people to feel that connection right across the world. And something actually that GE has done very well. And I learned a lot through that. So I was tasked with doing that, which is just transforming the business and taking best practices and sharing them across the world. fundamentally also saving money, but that the goal of it at the time was not about saving money. It was actually more of a cultural getting that same look and feel. But for customers, fundamentally, you want, because big global insurers deal with big global clients. So they wanted that to feel like it was a very cohesive group. So I did the transformation, and then I also became the chief underwriting officer for the group. And that was great because that gave me real exposure. While I'd always worked in global roles, being chief underwriting officer for that group was huge. So I spent a lot of my time was on North America because that's a big part of Zurich's portfolio. But we also went into new markets. We went into countries in Latin America. We were in Asia, Russia. I think they sold that one since. But there was lots of new stuff going on. And I got a lot of experience of dealing with different countries, even more different cultures than I'd had before, I think. And importantly, going to some countries and realizing that they've got something actually much better in a relatively small market than you're doing in another very big market. So this idea that you don't have to be the biggest to be the best and have all the ideas. You can actually find wonderful things going on in small places. And that, it was a very enriching part of my career. And I was at Zurich for 4 years.
Fantastic. And then here's the big one. This is the one that I don't know that anyone will get tired of talking about because of how monumental it was at the time, but around 2013-ish, you were named as CEO of Lloyds of London after a 325-year history within that very deeply rooted organization. They chose their first female CEO, and that was you. And if you ever thought before that you were stepping into something for which you were either not fully prepared for or had any fear or doubt, it seems like this would have been an extremely daunting transition. But again, you've commented how your journey really prepared you for that very large opportunity. I think in that, as you and I talked about it, it wasn't just the personal experience, but it was also the cultural shift. You've described yourself as a change agent, and there was a tremendous opportunity within Lloyds to bring them into literally the 21st century in so many ways. So talk a little bit about both the personal and the professional challenges of making that significant shift. And then I do want to tie it into a conversation around kind of what that means, innovation, and what innovation can do in times of challenge and adversity.
Well, if I just go right back to where we started in the 80s. Now, I worked in an office that was on the other side of the road to Lloyds. And in the 80s, Lloyds was really, really scary. I mean, really scary to a young woman. And it was the last place on earth I ever wanted to go. I reinsured some of the Lloyds syndicates. And of course, it's totally unique because it's a marketplace. And in London, very, very unique because it's a physical sort of trading floor where thousands and thousands of brokers and underwriters get together. But it was terrifying for me. So then in 2013, when I was approached, I could hardly believe that they were going to be considering me, because I just think those, decades earlier where I'd been so petrified of the place. The other thing was I didn't think they were serious because I was a woman, and I didn't think for one moment they would appoint a female CEO. So I went along for the interviews quite relaxed, because I thought, well, they're not really serious, but they want a woman on the list, and it'll be good experience for me to go through the interview process. And it was extraordinary.
Little did you know.
Yeah, and then it got closer and closer to December, which is when they wanted to announce, and I was still in the process, and I thought, this is extraordinary. And then I realized they were serious, and it all happened very quickly at the end, because leaks, the market's a very leaky place, and rumors get out. And so before we knew it, they were leaked, something had been leaked, and we needed to rush through the announcement, and it was extraordinary. Actually, I haven't checked what Business Insurance wrote about it, but I know one of the insurance trade magazines said the names, and the names in Lloyds were the traditional investors, they were called names. The names will be turning in their graves, was sort of one of the headlines. And I just thought, gosh, So I know that even when I started, there were some supporters and there were some people who weren't very supportive. And that was a bit tough on you as an individual, as a person, to read some things that weren't very complimentary. But you have to be tough. And actually, it was after that, I hardly ever read anything in the press about me again, because I realized that if I was to go through what I wanted to do, I couldn't be distracted by all of that noise. And very seldom would I read anything that was written about me, whether it was good or not. I used to let the comms team handle all of that. And if I needed to be made aware of something, then they would make me aware. But I decided it was too distracting, because it can really hurt you, and there isn't any reason to be distracted and hurt and waste energy and emotion on things that really at the end of the day aren't important. So personally, it was a real challenge to get through that. But likewise, I also felt I had a lot of support. So I knew that I'd been hired to change things, to digitalize the market, move it from a paper-based process that had been going on for, as you said, over 3 centuries, to an electronic trading or placing platform. This is what I'd been asked to do. And I knew that the board who hired me wanted me to succeed. And I thought, this is what I have to do, and I will do this. And that's when I think my transformation experience, and particularly the Zurich days, helped me a lot, because I'd managed big programs. And what also helped me a lot was my underwriting, because I had come from the underwriting side. And Lloyds is all about underwriting. It prides itself on its underwriters and their deep knowledge. And so I wasn't so much of an outsider. So that helped, because I'd grown up as an underwriter. But even so, it was extremely, extremely challenging, and there were some very dark days.
And you talk about surrounding yourself with people that exceed with certain skill sets that maybe might be lacking in yourself. So as you think about a major project like that, it's not rational to think that we would be good at everything, but yet the pressure to be good at everything is great. And I think it's significant for a woman, and a woman who's been given such an amazing opportunity as you had been given. But can you talk a little bit about, that's being very vulnerable, is to open yourself up, identify the weakness, and then find that person who's the right match for that.
Yeah, I am an impatient person by nature. I like things done very quickly. I am pretty competitive, and I certainly wanted us to be successful, but I realized that I needed an absolutely gifted chief operating officer to fundamentally be the overarching leader of this transformation project. And I found her. I found her in Shireen Puriha.
Fantastic.
And she was amazing. And we became the core team of it, but we became supports to each other. And we were the people that we would lock ourselves in a room, and that was when we could scream at each other. Nobody else knew we were screaming. Nobody else knew we were crying. And then we would sort of gather ourselves and say, step by step, let's go back out there. And so that was a very, very important part of the success of the transformation, because we were completely trusted in a completely trusted relationship, but in a way that we could experience, talk about the real emotions and the real concerns, we couldn't necessarily do to a wider audience. And that was a very important part of it. And I also made damn sure that my executive committee was going to be diverse in other ways. I wanted to make sure I had people from different cultures. I wanted to make sure I had definitely a gender split, and we basically got 50-50 on the executive committee. And I was very clear that when I was hiring people, I needed people not like me to also interview them, because of course I didn't want to hire people that I put in a box. So for instance, for me, because I've done a lot of different things in my life, because I am fairly independent, and I did leave the insurance industry, and I left this job because I didn't like it, and I've done things, I look for that in other people, you see. So if they have an unusual CV or resume, they're the people that I go after. But I know that I need some other people. I need different types of people on my team who maybe follow a more balanced and managed and controlled career. And so that's why I've always, for many years, made it very important that people not like me are also part of the decision process in hiring.
And you were a big proponent at Lloyds of diversity and inclusion. And you and I have spoken about, diversity and inclusion is not just male, female. Even within the female, genre, there are, women come in all shapes, sizes, colors, cultural ethnicities, sexual identity, whatever that might look like. And you were very outspoken while you were at Lloyds in making sure you were advancing diversity and inclusion across the board. But you also talked a little bit about there was some degree of an attempt to control that voice in you, to maybe, temper that, if you will. Talk a little bit about that, because I think that that's contemporary to today. We probably do find some of that, still that tempering of voice. Let you talk about it, but within a certain realm.
It's true. I had to temper some of it, and it became actually a real process that the communications team had to adopt. Because I didn't go to Lloyds thinking I must talk about diversity and inclusion, but when I realized, or when I investigated by having conversations with thousands of people, I investigated why the modernization had failed. So millions had been wasted on previous attempts to digitalize. And I tried to work out what it was. I realized it was because there weren't enough different voices in the market. The market had been hiring people like themselves. So my little team of clones that I had in Kansas City, I now had clones of thousands of people. And I realized then I needed to get different people in if we were going to make the change happen. And that was why I started to say about the importance of diversity. But every time I talked about it, it seemed to, even if it was only 10% of what I said, it seemed to get sort of multiplied, and people heard me talking about nothing but that. So much so that I remember going to a big event in Germany. We had the German ambassador opening it was a special event for Lloyds. We had the German ambassador, a man, opening up the day. He got up. I didn't know what he was going to say. He looked around the room and he said, "My goodness," he said, "you've got to do something about your lack of women in insurance, haven't you?" He said, "I look out on a sea of men," right? I thanked him. I did my speech. I didn't mention diversity. I didn't mention anything. And then throughout the rest of the day, I had all the individual meetings with people attending. And several of them said to me, "Oh, Inga, well said about the lack of women." And it hadn't come out of my mouth. And that's one of the challenges that we have. If women are doing all the talking, it seems to get amplified as though we're doing nothing but talking like that. So I got my comms team to track, so quite scientifically, how many times I talked about diversity inclusion, because I got direct feedback from the board that I was talking about it too much. And I actually managed it, and we managed it down to something like 17% was the time. People might have heard 87, but I know that I talked about it 17% of the time I made speeches.
Right. That's amazing. That's amazing to, to feel like we have to manage that conversation that way. But I think the most important thing is you haven't stopped having that conversation, and we are inviting men into the room to have that conversation, to be a part of that conversation. That's where we're going to help manage change. Certainly. We have just a couple of minutes left, and the title of this session was Innovation Through Diversity. And one of the things that really struck me as I, kind of walked through your career path with you was, the toughest challenge I would imagine that you faced at Lloyds, taking on that role within that culture, that had been the same for 3 centuries, but then also moving that organization from paper to digital. It prepared Lloyds in a way that I don't even think that you and Lloyds could have anticipated, and that was to be prepared for the pandemic. So as we close today, talk a little bit about the fact that they opened themselves up to you, they opened themselves up to your way of thinking and allowed you to drive change in the organization that now has benefited them during the pandemic. Say a little bit about that.
Yeah, because of course the digitalization was changing the way people were working, and people were feeling very threatened by this. And particularly the young people who just started out in their career and they thought their jobs were going to disappear. What in fact we did was we made sure that they were designing the jobs of the future with the technology, and then we were skilling them so that they could be part of the market and have really, really good careers. But it was an incredibly tough time because you are, in many people's eyes, threatening their work. But we did do it, and I think within the first 12 months, we've got 40% of all the business traded electronically. I mean, it was fantastic, and now it's just gone up and up. And then, of course, COVID happens. Bang, everyone's having to work from home, and they've got the electronic platform to do the trading instead of meeting physically face to face in the trading room. But who knew back in 2013, right, when I was hired, that it would be such a crucial part of surviving a pandemic that, yes, we sort of say that we'd looked, we'd sort of looked ahead and we knew there would be something happening. No one had really taken any mitigating actions for a massive pandemic. But there you were, Lloyds was well and truly prepared.
That's fantastic. And Inga, there are a lot of young women who are beginning their careers in the business insurance arena. What would you say in closing to them? What would be your few words of guidance and inspiration as they think about and contemplate their career path?
I would say believe in your own ability, and support networks are so crucial. Surround yourself with them. Surround yourself with people like you, but also surround yourself by people who are different to you. But fundamentally, it's in here. If you've got the passion and you believe in your own ability, the sky's the limit.
That's fantastic. Inga, thank you again for spending time with all of us, for sharing your story and your journey. Congratulations from everyone at Business Insurance and the Women to Watch Foundation for accepting the honor of being our 2020 Inspiration Award recipient. You truly are an inspiration to us, and we thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.